Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. Today, we are going to wrap up this on the value of next. Looking at what God has for us next. I've talked about, why change matters. We talked about, what to look for when it's time to make changes. Today, I just want to give a couple practical things on change and implementing some change. Now, I'm not going to get into the exhaustive kind of the leadership level of implementing change. There's a great book out there called Leading Change by John Cotter. He's going to get much more into the technicality of change, how you get weigh-in for buy-in, how you communicate change, adoption, implementation. That's not the purpose of this podcast. I'm really just establishing the fact that change is a value here at Element Church. We are always looking at what God has for us next. So we just have to be a culture that embraces that. Just going to throw out a few final thoughts on the subject of change. There is a time just to stop doing certain things. And I love what John Maxwell says. He goes, top strategies for dealing with a dead horse. There are times where certain things are just dead. But rather than making changes, rather than just stop doing those things, some people just kind of try to rework the dead horse. So, for example, he goes, here's strategies on dealing with a dead horse. Just buy a stronger whip. You could change riders, appoint a committee to study the dead horse. You could send out a memo declaring the horse really isn't dead. You can hire an expensive consultant to find out the real problem. You can harness several dead horses together for increased speed and efficiency. You could rewrite the standard definition of a live horse. Now, that's kind of humorous, but it's often really what many organizations do when it comes to something's dead and died. Rather than getting rid of the dead horse, they just start firing the wrong people. Well, they had nothing to do with the death of that horse. Let's just beat it harder. Let's work harder. Well, no, the thing's dead. There's just a time to go ahead and bury a dead horse. So if something's dead, just stop. Bury it. Move on. Next, you got to really just look at where are you? You got to start where you are. One of the biggest barriers to change is change in itself can sometimes be overwhelming because when you look at the size of how big the change might need to be, you just feel a little bit paralyzed, and there's just too many moving parts. There's just too much. And so the saying is true here, and that is the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. Because an elephant's too big. But if you just eat it one bite at a time, one day at a time, you'll eventually consume that elephant. The way lion tamers work is they, when they're going in you'll see them with the chair and they got that little whip. You go, well, it's just a little chair. Why in the world is that lion intimidated by a chair? Well, the way a lion's eyesight works is it can't focus on four legs of the stool. So what happens is it actually kind of gets physically paralyzed because it can't figure out where to focus. And so that lion tamer is actually kind of paralyzing the ability of that lion to focus with those four legs of a stool. Sometimes when you're looking at all the moving parts of change, you can get a little paralyzed. And so just stop and start where you are. Start with changing what you can, one piece, one bite at a time. Now, I always recommend start with you because there are things you want to change at the top that you might not be able to change at the top. There are things you might want to be able to change in other areas. You might not be able to change those things in other areas. So just go with what can I change in our organization with what's in my sphere and what I can control. And that's usually something to do with you. I can't really always change the church, but I can change me. I can change me as a pastor. I can change me as a leader. So often, if I start with me and my sphere, I often find the things that ultimately I wanted to change actually naturally changed as a byproduct in a trickleonomics, so to speak, of me just making changes that I could control. I like what D.L. Moody said. He said, I've had more difficulty with D.L. Moody than any other man alive. If you just deal with you, you've actually probably dealt with a lot, and the rest of the staff would probably be very happy about you tackling you. you. And then next, just remember steps. The steps of a righteous man are ordered of the Lord. Again, you aren't going to eat that elephant at one time. You aren't going to implement that massive new project at one time, but you can take steps. And don't worry about the steps you can't take. Just focus on the steps that you can. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 22, and the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you little by little. You will be unable to destroy them at once, lest the beasts of the field become too numerous for you, but the Lord your God will deliver them over to you and will inflict defeat upon them until they are all destroyed. So God says, hey, I've given you the promised land, but I'm not going to give it to you all at once because it would overwhelm you. And so the great principle here is God says, I'm not going to give you more than you're ready for. I'm not going to give you more than you can handle. You go ahead and fight this battle, and then I'll give you the next battle, and I'll give you the next piece of territory. We see this with David. He fought a lion, he fought a bear, and then he fought Goliath. And so don't worry about the battles tomorrow. Just go ahead and take the steps, take the battle that you have today. If you'll do today, then you'll be ready for what it is next. I like what Gordon Sullivan, former Army Chief of Staff, said. He said, for an enduring organization, there is no finite end state, only a journey, always becoming, never being. What you'll continually find is there's always something you're working on, always something that needs to change, always something that needs to be made better, and that's okay. Just every single day, if you continue to get better somewhere, continue to make necessary changes somewhere, you'll always be moving in the right direction. And it's much easier to move course correct a vehicle that's moving than a vehicle that's stopped. And I've just found if I'll keep moving in the direction I feel God has for us, it's much easier for him to course correct me because I am just moving and taking steps that he has for me today. All right, that wraps up our series on the value next. Next week, we're going to go ahead and start on the next value of T. Look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.